The Galactic Council's emergency meeting hall buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 100 worlds gathered in crisis session. At the center of the circular chamber, a massive holographic display showed the latest intelligence reports from the Outer Rim territories. Vorthak the Destroyer has awakened, announced Council Prime Zextar, his blue-scaled hands trembling as he manipulated the holographic controls. After 3 centuries of slumber, the beast has emerged from its hibernation cave on Kepler 442b. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Even the usually stoic crystalline delegates began resonating at frequencies that indicated deep concern. Vorthak wasn't just any dragon. It was the galaxy's most feared predator, a creature of legend that had single-handedly destroyed entire star systems during the Great Dragon Wars 500 years ago. The hologram shifted to show grainy surveillance footage. A massive shadow moved across the surface of Kepler 442b, easily the size of a small moon. Where it passed, the planet's surface cracked and burned. Volcanic eruptions followed in its wake, turning the once green world into a hellscape of fire and ash. The beast has already consumed the entire Zephyrian colony, reported Admiral Kexalo of the Antaran Navy, her forearms gesturing helplessly at the data streams. 7 million souls gone in a matter of hours. Our most advanced warships couldn't even scratch its hide. Council member after council member shared similar reports. The hegemony's quantum torpedoes had bounced harmlessly off the Dragon's scales. The Stellar Federation's antimatter cannons had only succeeded in making Vorthak angrier. Even the legendary warmonks of Proxima had retreated after their psychic. Attacks proved useless against the creature's alien mind. We estimate Vorthak will reach the core worlds within 6 standard months. Zextar continued grimly. At its current rate of consumption, it will devour every inhabited planet in its path. We're looking at the potential extinction of 47 civilizations. The chamber erupted in panicked chatter. Some delegates called for immediate evacuation of the threatened sectors. Others suggested awakening the ancient war titans from their deep storage vaults. A few even whispered about deploying planet-killer weapons, though everyone knew such measures would only destroy the worlds they were trying to save. "What about the humans?" asked a small crystalline voice from the observer section. The question came from Piptar, a young glimmering whose people had only recently achieved spaceflight. Surely Earth's warriors could help. The chamber fell silent, then erupted in what could only be described as nervous laughter. Even Zextar's usually diplomatic expression showed traces of amusement. The humans? Admiral Kexlo's mandibles clicked in what passed for chuckling among her species. "My dear Piptar, the humans are barely a Class 7 civilization. They've only had faster-than-light travel for 50 years. Their largest warships are smaller than our shuttlecraft. But they defeated the Vrex Armada," Piptar protested weakly. "Through luck and cunning. Nothing more," dismissed Counselor Texarim of the Hegemony. "Dragons aren't Vrex battlecruisers. You can't trick a force of nature with clever tactics." The discussion turned to more practical matters. Evacuation schedules were drawn up. Ancient weapon caches were located and their activation sequences prepared. The galaxy's greatest minds began calculating how many worlds they could sacrifice to buy time for the core systems. Meanwhile, 3 sectors away, Captain Sarah Chen of the human exploration vessel. Curiosity was having a very different kind of meeting with her 7-year-old daughter. "Emma, but Mom, why can't I come with you to the surface?" Emma asked, her lower lip jutting out in the universal expression of childhood disappointment. She sat cross-legged on the observation deck, still wearing her favorite pajamas covered in cartoon rockets and alien creatures. Sarah knelt down to her daughter's eye level, trying to explain the situation without causing panic. The Curiosity had been conducting routine surveys of the Outer Rim when they'd received the Council's emergency broadcast. Every ship in the sector had been ordered to maintain safe distances from Kepler 442b and assist with refugee evacuation efforts. "It's not safe, sweetheart," Sarah explained gently. "There's a very dangerous creature down there, and the grown-ups need to figure out how to help all the people who had to leave their homes." Emma's eyes widened with curiosity rather than fear. "What kind of creature?" Sarah hesitated. "How do you explain a galaxy-ending dragon to a 7-year-old? It's like a really big, really angry animal, the kind that doesn't like visitors. Is it hurt?" Emma asked with the innocent concern that only children could muster. "Maybe it's angry because it's scared or sick. Before Sarah could respond, the ship's communications officer called out urgently. "Captain, we're receiving a priority transmission from the Galactic Council. They're asking for volunteers for a suicide mission." Sarah's blood ran cold as she listened to the transmission. The Council had exhausted all conventional options. They were now seeking volunteers to carry an experimental quantum bomb directly to Vorthak's location. The chances of survival were estimated at less than 1%. As the adult conversation turned to technical discussions of payload delivery systems and sacrifice protocols, Emma quietly slipped away from the observation deck. She had an idea forming in her young mind, the kind of simple solution that adults often overlooked because it seemed too obvious. She made her way to the ship's extensive digital library and began searching for everything she could find about dragons, both real and mythological. Her reading level was already well above her age group, a trait that often surprised the alien species who encountered humans. She absorbed information about dragon behavior patterns, feeding habits, and social structures with the focused intensity that only a curious child could maintain. What she discovered would soon shake the foundations of galactic understanding, though none of the adults around her had any idea that the solution to their greatest crisis was being formulated by a little girl in rocket ship pajamas. 3 days after the Council's desperate call for suicide volunteers, the Curiosity remained in orbit around the refugee staging area of Station Omega-7. The massive space station teemed with evacuees from 17 different worlds, their ships forming a chaotic cloud around the central hub like frightened fish seeking shelter. Emma had spent those 3 days absorbing everything the ship's computer could tell her about dragons. She learned about the Great Dragon Wars, where massive creatures had swept across the galaxy like living storms. She read about their hibernation cycles, their feeding patterns, and their territorial behaviors. Most importantly, she discovered something that all the adult experts seemed to have missed. "Dragons aren't evil," she announced to her mother during breakfast in the captain's quarters. "They're just really lonely." Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "Sweetheart, this isn't one of your fairy tale books. This creature has destroyed entire planets." "But look," Emma said, pulling up holographic displays with the ease of a child raised in space. Her small fingers danced across the interface, calling up historical records. Every time a dragon attacked, it was right after waking up from a really long sleep. And they always went to places where lots of people lived together. She pointed to pattern after pattern in the data. Dragons emerging from centuries-long hibernation, immediately seeking out the most populated worlds, destroying cities but often leaving rural areas untouched. The attack seemed random to military strategists, but Emma saw something different. "They're looking for friends," she said simply, "but they're so big and scary that everyone runs away or tries to fight them. So they get angrier and sadder." Before Sarah could respond, the ship's communications array crackled to life. Admiral Kexlow's face appeared on the main screen, her forearms moving in agitated gestures. "Captain Chen, I need your ship's quantum scanners for a survey mission. We're trying to map Vorthak's movement patterns to predict its next target." "Understood, Admiral," Sarah replied professionally. "We can have the data to you within 6 hours." As the transmission ended, Emma tugged on her mother's uniform sleeve. "Mom, I want to go with you." "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly. "We're maintaining a safe distance of at least 50 astronomical units from that planet. Even that might not be enough if Vorthak decides to leave the surface." But Emma had already made up her mind with the stubborn determination that runs in human families. While the adults focused on their tactical discussions, she began planning her own mission. The survey operation proceeded smoothly at first. The Curiosity's advanced sensors painted a detailed picture of Vorthak's activities on the ravaged surface of Kepler 442b. The dragon had carved massive trenches across continents, apparently searching for something. Every few hours it would release a sound that registered on seismic equipment across the planet. A deep, resonant call that seemed to echo with ancient sadness. "It's trying to communicate," observed Dr. Martinez, the ship's xenobiologist. "These vocalizations have complex harmonic structures, almost like it's calling for others of its kind." "Others?" Captain Chen asked. "The records show Vorthak as the last of its species." "Exactly," Dr. Martinez said grimly. "It doesn't know that yet." Meanwhile, Emma had been busy in the ship's workshop area, using her small size to access maintenance crawlways that adults couldn't reach. She'd assembled what she called her friendship kit, a collection of items that included her favorite stuffed dragon, a selection of human foods, and her grandmother's music box that played an ancient lullaby. More importantly, she'd managed to reprogram one of the ship's emergency escape pods with the simple computer skills her mother had been teaching her. The pod's destination was set for the surface of Kepler 442b, specifically near the coordinates where Vorthak's calls seemed strongest. Her plan was beautifully simple in the way that only a child's plan could be. She would go down to the planet, find the lonely dragon, and be its friend. In her 7-year-old mind, this was obviously the solution that all the smart adults had somehow missed. The moment came during the ship's night cycle, when most of the crew was asleep. Emma slipped into her modified escape pod, clutching her friendship kit and wearing her favorite dress, the blue one with stars that she saved for special occasions. She figured meeting the galaxy's only dragon counted as special. The launch sequence activated automatically. By the time the ship's sensors detected the unauthorized pod departure, Emma was already committed to atmospheric entry. The Curiosity's bridge erupted in organized chaos as every officer tried to manually override systems that had been cleverly reprogrammed by small fingers. "Emergency stop." "All stop," Sarah shouted. But physics doesn't respond to parental authority. The escape pod was already caught in Kepler 442b's gravity well. "Captain, we can intercept with a shuttle," offered Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, "if we launch immediately." "Negative," Sarah said through gritted teeth, her training warring with her maternal instincts. Any rapid approach toward the planet might trigger defensive behavior from Vorthak. We could make the situation worse. On the planet's surface, Emma's pod landed with a gentle bump in a field of crystalline formations that had once been a Zephyrian city. The automated system scanned the environment and confirmed it was safe for a human child, though the elevated radiation levels would require limiting exposure time. Emma stepped out of the pod with her friendship kit, looking around at the alien landscape with wonder rather than fear. In the distance, she could see massive trenches carved through the crystal formations, and occasionally the ground would vibrate with the deep, sad calls of the galaxy's last dragon. She began walking toward the sound, her small figure dwarfed by the devastation around her, completely unaware that she was about to make first contact with a creature that had terrified civilizations for millennia. Above, in orbit, every military commander in the sector watched their scanners in helpless horror as a tiny human life sign moved steadily toward the largest, most dangerous creature the galaxy had ever known. Emma had been walking for 2 hours across the crystalline wasteland when she first saw Vorthak with her own eyes. The dragon was nothing like the terrifying monster described in the council reports. Curled in a massive crater that had once been a mountain, the creature looked tired and lonely, its scales dim with what Emma somehow recognized as sadness. The dragon was enormous, easily the size of a city block, but something about its posture reminded Emma of her old dog Max when he was sick. Its great head rested on the ground, and occasionally it would lift its massive snout to release one of those deep, mournful calls that echoed across the planet. Emma approached slowly, not from fear but from the same instinct that told her to move quietly around sleeping animals. Her grandmother had taught her that lesson during visits to the old farm on Earth, before they'd moved to the stars. Above in orbit, the bridge of the Curiosity had become a crisis command center. Admiral Kexlow had arrived with a small fleet, and representatives from the Galactic Council were participating via quantum link. Every eye watched the impossible scene unfolding on their screens. "The child is now within the creature's immediate sensory range," reported Dr. Martinez, his voice tight with tension. "If Vorthak detects her presence, it will kill her instantly," finished Admiral Kexlow. "Captain Chen, I need permission to initiate a distraction bombardment. If we can draw the creature's attention away from your daughter." "No," Sarah said firmly, though her hands were shaking as she gripped the command chair. "Any aggressive action might trigger exactly what we're trying to prevent." She's always been good with animals." On the surface, Emma had stopped about 50 meters from the dragon's head. This close, she could see that Vorthak's scales weren't the solid black described in the reports. They shimmered with deep blues and purples like an oil slick under starlight. The creature's breathing was labored, and Emma noticed strange markings along its neck that looked almost like scars. "Hello," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying in the thin atmosphere. The effect was immediate. Vorthak's enormous eye opened, an orb of golden light larger than Emma's entire body. The dragon's head lifted slightly, turning toward the sound with movements that were surprisingly gentle for something so massive. Emma felt a moment of genuine awe. The dragon was beautiful in a way that made her chest feel tight, like looking at a sunset or hearing her mother sing. She reached into her friendship kit and pulled out her stuffed dragon, a small, purple creature she'd named Tiny. "I brought you a friend," she said, holding up the toy. "His name is Tiny, but that's kind of a joke because he's actually pretty big for a stuffed animal." Vorthak's head tilted slightly, a gesture so human-like that observers across the galaxy held their breath. The dragon's massive eye focused on the small toy, then shifted to Emma herself. For a long moment, the two simply looked at each other, the galaxy's most feared predator and a 7-year-old girl in a star-covered dress. In the council chambers, Sextar was frantically coordinating with military commanders from a dozen systems. "All ships are to maintain current positions," he ordered. "Any intervention could result in the immediate death of the human child and potentially enrage the creature beyond containment." "Sir," interrupted a communications officer, "we're receiving requests from 17 different news networks for live coverage rights. Apparently this encounter is being broadcast across the galaxy. Indeed, on worlds throughout known space, beings gathered around viewing screens to watch the impossible scene. Parents held children close as they witnessed a human child calmly conversing with a creature of legend." Emma continued her one-sided conversation, settling cross-legged in the crystalline dust. "My mom says you're really old and really angry, but I think you're just sad. My teacher told us about animals that sleep for a long time, and sometimes when they wake up, everything is different and confusing." She opened her kit and pulled out a small container of Earth cookies. "These are from my home planet. They have chocolate in them, which is really good. I don't know if dragons can eat chocolate, but I thought maybe you'd like to try." Vorthak's response was unexpected. The dragon slowly lowered its massive head until it was resting on the ground, just a few meters from Emma. The movement was careful, deliberate, as if the creature understood how easy it would be to accidentally harm the small being before it. From this distance, Emma could see that the dragon's eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably ancient and deeply sad. She had the sudden insight that this creature had been alone for longer than her entire species had existed. "You miss your family, don't you?" she asked softly. "That's why you're calling for them." The dragon's response was a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in its chest. It wasn't the aggressive roar that had terrified countless civilizations, but something gentler, almost like the purring of an enormous cat. Emma stood up slowly and took a step closer. The dragon's eye tracked her movement but didn't show any signs of aggression. Encouraged, she took another step, then another, until she was standing just an arm's length from the creature's massive snout. "I know you don't mean to hurt people," she said, reaching out tentatively. "You're just big and strong and don't know your own power. Like my friend Jake's puppy before it learned not to bite so hard when it plays." Her small hand made contact with the dragon's scales, and both child and creature seemed to freeze. The scales were warm and surprisingly smooth, like sun-heated stone. For the first time in centuries, Vorthak was experiencing gentle, friendly physical contact from another intelligent being. The dragon's eye slowly closed, and another rumble emerged from its chest, this one unmistakably expressing contentment. Across the galaxy, military commanders and politicians watched in stunned silence as a 7-year-old human girl accomplished what their greatest weapons could not. Emma smiled and patted the dragon's snout gently. "There you go," she said. "You just needed a friend." Emma had been sitting with Vorthak for nearly an hour, gently petting the dragon's snout and sharing stories about her life aboard the Curiosity. The massive creature listened with what could only be described as rapt attention, occasionally rumbling responses that Emma interpreted as questions or comments. "And that's when the food replicator broke and started making everything taste like soap," she was explaining, when Vorthak's head suddenly lifted. The dragon's attention turned skyward, and Emma followed its gaze to see dozens of ships arriving in the upper atmosphere. The Galactic Council had mobilized every available fleet in the sector. Sleek Antaran destroyers hung alongside the geometric forms of hegemony cruisers and the crystalline structures of Stellar Federation ships. It was the largest military gathering in decades, all focused on a single planet where a little girl was making friends with a dragon. Emma frowned as she watched the ships assume what she recognized as combat positions. "Don't mind them," she told Vorthak. "Grown-ups always think fighting is the answer to everything. They probably don't realize you're not actually angry anymore." But Vorthak's body language had changed. The dragon's scales were beginning to shimmer with heat distortion, and the rumbles from its chest had taken on a different tone. Emma might be only 7 years old, but she was a spacer kid. She knew the signs of rising tension. "Hey, it's okay," she said quickly, placing both hands on the dragon's snout. "They're just scared because they don't understand. When I was little, I was scared of thunder until my dad explained it was just clouds bumping into each other." On the Curiosity's bridge, Captain Sarah Chen was engaged in increasingly heated discussions with Admiral Kexelo and the council representatives. The military commanders wanted to use Emma's apparent connection with Vorthak to deliver a killing blow, while the diplomats were frantically trying to understand how a human child had succeeded where their greatest minds had failed. "Captain Chen," Admiral Kexelo's voice was tight with urgency, "we have a narrow window of opportunity here. If your daughter can keep the creature calm for just 30 more minutes, we can position our quantum torpedoes for a simultaneous strike from all vectors." "Absolutely not," Sarah snapped. "You are not using my daughter as bait for an assassination attempt." "Sir," interrupted Dr. Martinez, studying the biological readings from the surface. "I'm detecting massive changes in Vorthak's biochemistry. Stress hormones are spiking rapidly. I think the presence of the fleet is triggering defensive responses." Indeed, Vorthak was beginning to show signs of the rage that had made it legendary. The ground around the dragon started to crack as its body temperature rose. The mournful calls were being replaced by sounds that registered as pure threat on every species' instinctive danger scales. Emma felt the change immediately. The warm scales under her hands were becoming uncomfortably hot, and she could sense the dragon's growing agitation. But instead of running away, she did something that would be remembered throughout galactic history. She leaned forward and gently kissed the tip of Vorthak's nose. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The dragon's aggressive posturing stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. The heat shimmer faded from its scales, and the threatening rumbles dissolved into something that sounded almost like surprise. Across the galaxy, beings watching the live broadcast fell silent. In the halls of the Galactic Council, ancient politicians who had seen the rise and fall of empires stared at their screens in shock. Vorthak, the destroyer of worlds, had been calmed by a simple gesture of affection from a human child. "There," Emma said softly. "That's how my mom makes me feel better when I'm upset. Sometimes you just need to know someone cares about you." The dragon's massive eye focused on Emma with an intensity that seemed to look straight through her. Then, moving with impossible delicacy for a creature of its size, Vorthak gently nuzzled the child's cheek with the side of its snout. The gesture was broadcast across 100 worlds, and the reaction was immediate. On Earth, children watching the feeds began crying, not from fear but from the pure emotional impact of seeing such gentleness from such a massive creature. On the warlike world of Proxima, the legendary war monks began what would later be called the Great Meditation, a collective effort to understand how violence could be transformed into connection. "My God," whispered Dr. Martinez. "Look at the neural activity readings. The dragon's brain patterns are completely different now. It's like it's remembering how to be peaceful." Emma noticed something else changing. The scars along Vorthak's neck were beginning to glow with a soft internal light. As she watched, fascinated, symbols began appearing on the dragon's scales. Beautiful, flowing patterns that seemed to tell a story. "You're not just a dragon, are you?" she asked with the insight that sometimes came to children. "You're something more special." The symbols on Vorthak's scales pulsed brighter, and Emma felt a strange sensation, as if words were forming in her mind that weren't her own. Images flashed through her consciousness, memories of a time when dragons soared between stars, not as destroyers but as guardians and guides for younger species. She saw Vorthak as it had been eons ago, part of a vast network of intelligent beings who had helped nurture life throughout the galaxy. The dragon species had been teachers, philosophers, living bridges between different forms of consciousness. But something had gone wrong. A great war, a terrible loss, and the gradual dying out of their kind until only Vorthak remained. "You weren't trying to hurt anyone," Emma realized aloud. "You were trying to find students again." But everyone forgot that dragons used to be teachers. The light from Vorthak's scales grew stronger, and suddenly every ship in orbit began receiving the same transmission, not through their communications equipment, but directly into the minds of their crews. It was Vorthak's voice, ancient and sad but filled with hope, speaking in perfect harmony to every species simultaneously. "Little teacher," the voice said, addressing Emma specifically, "you have reminded me of who I was meant to be." Across the galaxy, the perception of dragons began to change forever, but for Emma it was simply time to share the chocolate cookies she'd brought, because making new friends always made her hungry. The telepathic contact with Vorthak had affected Emma in ways that Dr. Martinez was still trying to understand. As she sat sharing cookies with the galaxy's last dragon, her young mind was processing memories and knowledge that spanned millions of years. But instead of being overwhelmed, she seemed to be filtering the information through her 7-year-old perspective, making sense of cosmic concepts in beautifully simple ways. "So you're like a really old teacher who fell asleep for too long, and when you woke up all your students were gone," she said, offering Vorthak another cookie. The dragon accepted it delicately, its massive jaws carefully manipulating the tiny treat. The symbols on Vorthak's scales continued to pulse with soft light, and Emma found she could read them like a book written in emotions and pictures. The dragon species had indeed been the galaxy's first teachers, appearing on worlds where life was just beginning to develop intelligence. They had guided countless species through their early steps into consciousness, helping them develop philosophy, art, and the fundamental concepts of cooperation. But then came the Silence Wars, a conflict so ancient that it predated recorded history for most species. An enemy from outside the galaxy had sought to destroy not just life, but the very concept of intelligence itself. The dragons had fought to protect their students, sacrificing themselves in battles that raged across dimensions. Vorthak had been the youngest of its kind, placed in emergency hibernation to preserve at least one member of the species. When it finally awakened centuries later, the galaxy had moved on. The species the dragons had nurtured had evolved, developed their own ways of learning, and forgotten their first teachers entirely. "That's why you were so angry," Emma realized. "You woke up and all your students had grown up and moved away without saying goodbye." The dragon's rumble of agreement was tinged with ancient sadness. Through their connection, Emma felt the weight of Vorthak's loneliness. Centuries of searching for any trace of the species it had once guided, finding only civilizations that feared it as a monster. Above them, the assembled fleet remained in tense formation. Admiral Kexlow was arguing with council representatives who couldn't decide whether they were witnessing first contact with a previously unknown form of life or somehow communicating with a creature that had been presumed to be nothing more than a dangerous beast. "The implications are staggering," Dr. Martinez was explaining to Captain Chen. "If Vorthak truly is what these readings suggest, then dragons aren't just massive predators. They're some kind of ancient guide species, possibly the first intelligence to achieve spaceflight in our galaxy." Sarah Chen watched her daughter on the surface monitors, marveling at how naturally Emma had adapted to the impossible situation. The child was now lying against Vorthak's massive forelimb, using the dragon as a sort of living lounge chair while she continued her conversation. "The council is requesting a formal diplomatic dialogue," reported the communications officer. "They want to establish protocols for interspecies contact with a dragon." Emma, meanwhile, was learning about the vast loneliness that had driven Vorthak's destructive behavior. The dragon hadn't been trying to destroy civilizations. It had been trying to recreate the teaching relationships of its youth. But without understanding how to approach the advanced species of the modern galaxy, its attempts at contact had been misinterpreted as attacks. "You know what your problem was?" Emma said with the directness that only children could manage. "You were trying to teach people who already thought they knew everything. Grown-ups are like that sometimes. They get so busy being smart that they forget how to learn new things." She sat up, struck by a sudden idea. "But kids still remember how to learn. I bet there are lots of kids who would love to have a dragon teacher. We just need to introduce you properly so their parents don't get scared." Through their mental connection, Emma shared her own memories of learning, the excitement of discovering new concepts, the joy of having someone patient enough to answer endless questions, the security of knowing that a teacher cared about her growth and understanding. Vorthak's scales brightened with something that felt like hope. The dragon had never considered that perhaps it wasn't the students who had grown beyond needing teachers, but simply that it needed to find students who were still young enough to embrace wonder. "I have an idea," Emma announced, both to Vorthak and to the communication devices she knew were monitoring her every word. "What if we had a school in space? A place where kids from different planets could come to learn from Vorthak about the really old, important stuff that computers can't teach?" The suggestion rippled through the fleet above. On the bridge of the Curiosity, Sarah Chen found herself considering the practical aspects of her daughter's proposal, with the kind of serious attention usually reserved for military strategies. "She's right," Dr. Martinez said suddenly. "Look at the neurological data. Vorthak's brain patterns are becoming more organized, more purposeful, the longer it interacts with the child. It's remembering its original function. On worlds throughout the galaxy, parents and educators who had been watching the historic encounter began to consider the implications. Here was a being with millions of years of accumulated wisdom, desperate to share its knowledge with worthy students. And here was proof that humans, specifically human children, could not only safely interact with the creature but actually help it rediscover its true nature." Emma yawned and snuggled closer to Vorthak's warm scales. The excitement of the day was catching up with her, and the dragon's rhythmic breathing was better than any lullaby. "I think you're going to be the best teacher in the galaxy," she murmured sleepily. "We just need to help everyone else figure that out too." As she drifted off to sleep against the side of the galaxy's most feared creature, Emma had no idea that her simple act of friendship was about to transform not just one lonely dragon, but the entire educational philosophy of hundreds of worlds. The age of the dragon schools was about to begin. Emma woke up 6 hours later to find herself covered by what she initially thought was a very warm, very large blanket. Then she remembered where she was and realized that Vorthak had carefully curled one massive wing around her while she slept, protecting her from the planet's harsh winds and temperature fluctuations. "Good morning," she said, stretching and patting the dragon's scales. "Did you sleep too?" Vorthak's rumble of response came with an overlay of telepathic communication that Emma was getting better at interpreting. The dragon hadn't slept in the traditional sense, but had entered a meditative state while maintaining protective vigilance over the small human in its care. Above them, the political situation had transformed overnight. News of the encounter had spread beyond the military and diplomatic channels to reach civilian populations across the galaxy. The reaction had been unprecedented. Instead of panic, there was fascination. Children on dozens of worlds had begun asking their parents why they couldn't have dragon teachers too. On the bridge of the Curiosity, Captain Chen was dealing with a communication backlog that included formal requests from the Galactic Council, interview requests from major news networks, and, surprisingly, preliminary enrollment inquiries from parents across 7 star systems. "Ma'am," reported the communications officer, "we're now receiving requests from educational institutions on 43 worlds. They want to know if the dragon would consider visiting their schools." Dr. Martinez looked up from his xenobiology readings with excitement. "Captain, the cultural implications are staggering. We're looking at the potential rediscovery of an ancient teaching methodology that could revolutionize how species learn from each other." Emma, unaware of the galactic excitement she'd caused, was giving Vorthak a tour of her friendship kit. She'd shown the dragon her stuffed animal Tiny, shared her grandmother's music box, and was now trying to explain the concept of coloring books. "See? You stay inside the lines, but you get to pick whatever colors you want," she explained, holding up a picture of a simple flower. "It's like following rules, but still being creative." Through their mental connection, Vorthak shared a concept that made Emma's eyes widen with wonder. The dragon showed her how its species had once taught young civilizations by creating vast, living artworks in space, using stellar phenomena, planetary movements, and cosmic dust clouds as their canvas. Each lesson had been a masterpiece that could be observed and studied for generations. "You painted with stars?" Emma asked in amazement. "That's so much cooler than crayons." The dragon's amusement rippled through their link, but there was sadness too. Those cosmic artworks had been lost in the Silence Wars, and Vorthak had forgotten how to create them. It had been so long since it had felt the joy of teaching, of watching young minds grasp new concepts and grow from the experience. "Maybe we can figure out how to do it again," Emma suggested with the boundless optimism of childhood. But we should probably start with something smaller, like maybe just one moon instead of a whole star system. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a shuttle from the Curiosity. Captain Chen had finally decided that the diplomatic situation required her personal involvement, especially since her daughter seemed to have accidentally become humanity's first dragon ambassador. Emma waved enthusiastically as her mother's shuttle landed nearby. "Mom, come meet Vorthak properly. He's been telling me the most amazing stories about the old days." Sarah Chen approached cautiously, her military training warring with maternal concern. She'd faced hostile alien species before, but nothing had prepared her for the surreal experience of seeing her 7-year-old daughter casually introducing her to a creature of galactic legend. "Hello, Vorthak," she said formally, trying to maintain diplomatic protocols while her daughter grinned at the awkwardness of the situation. The dragon's response came as a gentle telepathic touch, not invasive, but offering a brief connection that conveyed respect and gratitude. Sarah felt a flash of the ancient intelligence behind those golden eyes, along with something that could only be described as paternal affection for the small human who had shown it kindness. "He likes you," Emma announced. "He says human parents are interesting because they're protective, but also willing to let their children explore and learn. Most species either keep their kids too safe or throw them out too early." The next few hours became an impromptu diplomatic session, unlike anything in galactic history. Representatives from the major powers began arriving on the planet's surface, but instead of formal negotiation chambers, they found themselves sitting in a circle on crystalline sand, while a 7-year-old girl facilitated communication with a creature older than their civilizations. Emma had developed her own translation method, interpreting Vorthak's complex telepathic concepts into simple terms that everyone could understand. When the dragon shared a memory of teaching early Antarans about mathematics using the orbital mechanics of their moon system, Emma explained it as showing them how to count by watching Space Orcs dance. The breakthrough came when Counselor Texram of the hegemony asked the obvious question: if Vorthak is truly willing to resume its teaching role, what would such a program require? Emma looked to Vorthak, then back to the assembled diplomats with the kind of serious expression that meant a child was about to say something profound. "He needs students who still remember how to wonder about stuff. And he needs teachers to help him, grown-ups who can help translate the really old knowledge into things kids today can understand." She paused, then added with typical 7-year-old directness, "And he needs friends. Being the only one of your kind is really lonely. Even for someone who's super old and wise." The dragon's scales pulsed with gentle light, and suddenly every being present felt a brief telepathic touch, not invasive, but sharing just enough of Vorthak's vast loneliness to help them understand the emotional reality behind the academic discussion. Admiral Kex Lowe, who had arrived expecting to coordinate military operations, found herself wiping away tears she didn't know her species could shed. The isolation. How did it endure such emptiness for so long? "He almost didn't," Emma said quietly. "That's why he was so angry when he woke up. But now he remembers that teaching makes the loneliness go away." By the end of the day, the framework for the galaxy's first dragon school had been established. Vorthak would work with carefully selected educators to develop curricula that combined ancient wisdom with modern understanding. Students would be chosen not for their academic achievements, but for their curiosity and willingness to learn. And at the center of it all would be a 7-year-old human girl who had solved the galaxy's greatest crisis by doing what came naturally to her species, making friends with someone who needed one. 2 years after Emma Chen kissed the nose of the galaxy's deadliest dragon, the Vorthak Academy orbited the binary star system of Alpha Centauri like a living jewel. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering, human innovation, merged with alien technologies and guided by Vorthak's ancient understanding of how learning spaces should feel. Emma, now 9 years old and considerably more famous than she was comfortable with, walked through the Academy's crystal corridors toward her favorite classroom. She wore the simple uniform that all Academy students wore, regardless of species. A practical jumpsuit that could adapt to any environment they might visit during their lessons. "Good morning, Professor Vorthak," she said formally as she entered the vast central chamber where the dragon rested. The greeting was part of their daily ritual, even though she usually ended up calling him by his nickname, Vor, before the lesson was over. The dragon had changed remarkably over the past 2 years. His scales now held a permanent, gentle luminescence, and the ancient scars on his neck had transformed into beautiful patterns that seemed to tell the story of the galaxy's development. Most importantly, his eyes held the contentment that comes from rediscovering one's true purpose. "Good morning, young teacher," Vorthak replied, the telepathic words accompanied by a warm rumble that the 30 other students in the class had learned to recognize as his greeting purr. The students were a diverse group, young beings from 12 different species, all selected not for their academic prowess, but for their curiosity and empathy. There was Zix, a young crystalline whose harmonics had perfect pitch, Keeper 7 of 9, an AI construct housed in a mobile shell, who had specifically requested to learn about biological creativity, and Piptar's daughter, Crystal Song, whose parents had insisted she be among the first enrollees. "Today we're going to learn about the great patience," Vorthak announced, and the chamber around them began to shift. The walls became transparent, revealing the swirling cosmos beyond, and suddenly the students found themselves floating in a gentle field that allowed them to move freely through three-dimensional space. Emma had experienced hundreds of these lessons, but they still filled her with wonder. Vorthak's teaching method involved shared experience rather than simple information transfer. When he taught about stellar formation, students felt the gradual compression of cosmic dust over millions of years. When explaining ecosystem development, they experienced the delicate balance of life from the perspective of both predator and prey. "The great patience," Vorthak continued, "is the understanding that wisdom cannot be rushed. Watch." The space around them filled with images of civilizations rising and falling, species learning to cooperate across vast distances, and the slow development of empathy between beings so different they could barely comprehend each other's existence. Emma felt the familiar tingle that meant Vorthak was sharing something particularly important. Through their special connection, she experienced the dragon's memories of watching the first alliance between the crystal beings and the energy creatures of the Magellanic Clouds, a partnership that had taken 3,000 years to develop but had resulted in art forms that neither species could have created alone. "Miss Emma," called out Trillix, a young hegemony citizen whose parents were diplomats, "why didn't the ancient dragons just force everyone to get along faster?" Emma floated closer to her classmate, having learned to help translate Vorthak's more complex concepts. "Because forcing someone to understand something isn't the same as helping them learn it," she explained. "Like when my mom tried to make me eat vegetables by hiding them in my food. I didn't learn to like them until she let me help cook them and understand why they were good for me." Vorthak's approval rippled through the mental connection he maintained with all his students. This was exactly the kind of insight he had hoped his young teachers would develop. The understanding that true learning required choice, patience, and personal discovery. The lesson continued with hands-on experience of different approaches to interspecies cooperation. Students paired with partners from different worlds to solve problems that required combining their unique perspectives. Emma found herself working with Jin Na, a young Stellar Federation citizen whose species experienced time differently than humans. "Your people think so fast," Jin-Na commented as they worked together to design a communication protocol for beings who experienced reality at different temporal rates. "But you also stop to feel things in ways we don't. And your people see patterns we miss because we're too focused on individual moments," Emma replied. "That's what Vor means about cooperation making everyone stronger." As the lesson wound down, the students gradually returned to the central chamber. But instead of the formal dismissal that characterized most educational institutions, they gathered in a loose circle around Vorthak for what had become known as reflection time. "What did you learn today that surprised you?" Vorthak asked, his mental voice warm with genuine interest. The responses came from around the circle, insights about patience, discoveries about the value of different perspectives, questions that had arisen during the collaborative exercises. Emma listened with the practiced ear of someone who had become accustomed to translating between different ways of thinking. When it was her turn, she shared something that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "I've been thinking about how humans are good at making friends with beings who are really different from us," she said. "Maybe that's because we're kind of in the middle, Not the smartest or the strongest or the oldest, but good at understanding how others feel. Vorthak's scales brightened with what Emma had learned to recognize as his version of a proud smile. Through their connection, she felt his agreement and something more, a sense that her species might indeed have a special role to play as the galaxy continued to evolve and grow. As the students prepared to leave for their various living quarters, Vorthak made an announcement that would soon resonate across the galaxy. "I have been in contact with the deep archives of the ancients," he said. "There are others like me, sleeping in hidden places, waiting for the right time to awaken. I believe that time has come." Emma's eyes widened with excitement and a touch of concern. "You mean there are more dragons? Will they be as lonely as you were?" "Not if we prepare proper welcomes for them," Vorthak replied. "Not if we have teachers ready to help them remember who they were meant to be." As the Academy continued its orbit around the twin stars, plans began forming for the greatest educational expansion in galactic history, and at its heart would be a simple principle discovered by a 7-year-old human girl, that sometimes the most important lesson you can teach someone is that they are not alone. The age of the dragon schools had begun, but Emma Chen had already learned its most important truth. The best way to heal an ancient wound is with the gentle power of friendship.